Thank you, Acting President. I rise to speak on the Voluntary Assisted Dying Amendment Bill 2025, and this is a challenging bill, as Ms Umakora just referred to. It's one that we are debating, and it's been good to hear the discussions in the chamber today and also in the lower house. And I want to thank all those that have contacted me on this issue, because I have received phone calls and letters and emails, as I'm sure many of us had, and I've also reached out to people that have worked in the industry just to get their understanding. And I know that in the discussion that we're having today, we are not re-examining voluntary assisted dying. It was a debate that was held at length in 2017, and it passed by a very small margin. I believe it was just 4 votes. And it is not an easy discussion or a topic, but I believe we all have that, there is a time to live and a time to die. And death often brings a new perspective, certainly to let go of the small stuff and gain perspective on what really matters. And we approach this debate with a conscience vote, and many have shared their own experiences and of those they know that are going to influence their decision today. Now, I had a very unusual situation in that I had all 4 grandparents live into their 80s, which is not always the case. I had my grandfather, who was very keen to live till he was 120, but my own father died much younger. He had cancer, and I remember it was when we got engaged that he learned that he had cancer, and it was 14 years that he lived with that cancer. And I remember speaking to the doctor after he passed away, and he said that he had actually lived a lot longer than they had expected. And it was long enough to see our 3 children born, which was very, very special. But I've witnessed close friends whose lives have been cut short much sooner in life. And I know people who've chosen to navigate voluntary assisted dying. Now, it's a service that is available, and one that more people have accessed than the government first thought when it was first introduced. The challenge with this debate is that we can end up narrowing our focus, and it's important, as my colleague Ms Barth talked about in her contribution, about the valuable services of palliative care, particularly in regional areas. There are professionals that are focused on alleviating pain and providing that relief, and to help people focus on living and be comfortable where they choose to be, at home or in care. But I know that there are inequities that we see in our health system, and I think of MMD, and I know the disparity in support for people, particularly those over 65 that get diagnosed with MND, and how expensive it is for them to access services, those critical services that are needed to help them be able to live with MND, in the costs of equipment, compared to people that are under 65 who are able to access support much more easily. But I think one of the challenges that I've had with this legislation is that there was a review conducted by the Department of Health back in 2023 and 24, and it found that after the first 4 years of operation, found that voluntary assisted dying is working as it was intended. And initially, when that review was put out, it was indicated that they were not going to consider legislative change as part of that. And so I've heard from a number of people that have raised concerns, saying that stakeholders would have actually participated and got engaged a lot more in that process had they been aware that legislative change would be forthcoming. Now, we've heard it said that the initial debate back in 2017 did come up with numerous safeguards. I think it was about 68 safeguards that they talked about in 2017 when voluntary assisted dying was first introduced. But we have heard it said in the chamber today, those safeguards have been referred to as barriers. And I think that is a concern in the shift in the consideration of this. And also, a while ago, I remember when the Greens put forward a private members bill, and I was very concerned to read in the review of that, they were wanting a review in 3 years, that it would look at whether or not children have the capacity to consider voluntary assisted dying, and that's certainly not a direction that I want our state to head. Now, this bill that we're considering today passed the lower house 64 votes to 14, and I guess there's a number of amendments that have been put forward here today, and I think it's important in this chamber to do what we can to contribute to improving legislation. Now, the first that I'm putting, well, actually, I think it's a double up because Ms Blanthorne's put in a similar one, which is a reasoned amendment. But I think that need to debate or have greater consultation on the bill is really important, and not one that we've seen, as I've mentioned, with the review. Wasn't meant to be about legislative change, but then we now have the bill before us today. Now, there's also a number of textual amendments that talk to the conscientious objection in Clause 6, and then it talks about the minimum information that's provided in the Act, and I think being able to specify that information is really important, and also to ensure, I guess I'm really keen to ensure that doctors do have the right to conscientiously object. That is just so important. I think we're being given a free vote in this chamber, and they need to have that freedom as well. I think the ability to initiate discussions is one that will be talked about during the committee stage, and that restriction on raising the issue is a really important point. I think I attended a doctor's appointment recently with a specialist for my son, and I was hanging on every word the specialist said. I think what is said by a doctor is really important, and raising it could put additional pressure on people, and I think that is possibly a consequence that we haven't focused on enough in this debate, and I've seen the impact that this decision can have on people and their family and friends, and it's not an easy decision. It's one thing to know that you're going to die, to choose a date, who, where, when, how is a whole nother pressure that, is a very difficult one for families to navigate. Life expectancy, that threshold, moving from 6 to 12 months, I think retaining that safeguard that was put in place initially, because the longer time frames, I've heard from doctors that have sort of said it is harder to be accurate with the diagnosis. And then there's the minimum consultation period that we've seen shifting in this bill. I think retaining that would be a better approach. And the experience requirement of the 5 years dropping down to 1, I don't think is a necessarily good approach, because this is not, selling a house or buying a car. This is quite a significant decision that people are considering. Now, my concern is that as the door opens just that bit wider, if doctors and others raise it as part of end-of-life care discussion, that it will have unintended consequences, as I said. And also, I do want us to consider the vulnerability of people who face the decision. It does have that added burden on the family, and there's also the people could be pressured by family members, because I know as people become aware of the costs, a $750,000 room or access to services, you certainly don't want them to feel that pressure to end their life sooner. And I know this whole conversation does raise that whole quality of life, and people respond very differently for what someone might consider a quality of life. Someone else has no issue with that. And I remember listening to a conversation once where it was talked about a family who had a child, born with disabilities, and they was talking about it's like being on an aeroplane, and you think you're going to go to Europe where it's all, flashing lights and very busy and, going to be a pretty amazing holiday, and then suddenly you hear the captain come on and talk about, well, you're going to Holland, and Holland has got windmills and tulips, and it's very different and a very slower pace of life, but they just talked about still valuing life in that and how precious life is, whatever situation people find themselves in. And I guess just reflecting on this debate made me reflect on my own name, because people often ask me, how do you get Gail, G-A-E-L-L-E? And I actually had a sister who died before I was born, and her name was Danielle. And so as a result, my parents chose to call me Gail, because funnily enough, I was actually born, or I was due to be born on the day of her birthday. So every day when I spell out my name, I guess I'm reminded of how short life is and how precious it is, because she passed away when she was just 3. So I do stand here as someone who respects people's decisions and the choices in very exceptional circumstances, but I also want to protect those, particularly the elderly, who may feel pressure to go down this track if the option is presented to them. And I received a letter from a person who pointed out that as politicians we're getting a conscience vote, as I mentioned, and yet this legislation takes away the conscientious objection of doctors who do not wish to provide that minimum information about voluntary assisted dying. But in closing, I do really want to thank all those who care for people at the end of their life, however long or short it is. They are incredible individuals, and I have witnessed their work, and I'm absolutely in awe of it. And in regional areas, I would love to see expanded access to palliative care services, to have that focus on holistic care, to provide support for people who are close to death, that psychological support, the social support, the emotional support, and often cultural and spiritual needs as well, to help people relieve their pain, their stress and their suffering. But whatever the outcome today, I hope to be around when this legislation is next reviewed, and we'll be watching closely to see what impact these changes make. Thank you. Do you want me to circulate? Yeah, circulate. I'll move the amendments and move the reason amendment. Thank you. So I move that all the words after that be omitted and replaced with "This House refuses to read this bill a second time until adequate time is given to allow full consideration of the anticipated and unintended consequences changes to the Voluntary Assisted Dying Act 2017 and until further and broader consultation is undertaken." I'm happy to circulate the other amendments, but if there is a double up, I'll have a look at them in detail and maybe, yeah, we can sort that out later. Thank you.